Thanks. I was honored and humbled to ask to summarize bird migrations in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I really wish I could show you a picture of 6 species from which to choose from. But, you know, across the globe, that did not work. What am I doing wrong here? Sorry, guys. Let's see, do you know how I can play this? Oops. Well, I got some really cool animations in here that I was really hopeful to be able to show you. Okay, that's unfortunate. Sorry. Now I'm just skipping through this and making you all dizzy. Anyways, this was a really cool animation of actual bird migration data from across the globe. And as you can imagine, you see a huge wave of birds moving north in the spring and a huge wave of birds moving south in the fall. And you know, across the globe, there's an estimated now, the most recent estimates are 18,000 species of birds. And the vast majority of those are going to take to the wing for a promise of you know, better seasonal habitat to increase their fitness. You know, we generally here we think of our birds as the ones that breed here, and then in the fall they pick up and they winter somewhere sunny, warm, and tropical, and then they come back here and breed year after year after year. But in fact, most birds spend much less of their lifetime on their breeding grounds. And so we need to kind of flip that line of thinking on what potentially are our birds and how the impacts and management we have here are having on other places and vice versa. So, you know, birds also spend up to 2 or 3 months every year traveling between these regions. And, you know, oftentimes a bird's first real flight is up to 1,200 miles to an area that it doesn't even know exists. And how it gets there and why it goes to where it goes is still a huge mystery to us. You know, some travel 100 miles per hour in the headwinds on the top of the Himalayas or across the entire Pacific Ocean in the middle of the night. And so we're just now learning about these hidden mysteries of bird migrations. But today what I want to focus on are some of the examples we have in the greater Yellowstone region. And I'm sure most of you have learned about bird migrations in your basic science classes, and as the theory goes, the bird breeds on their breeding ground, they pick up, they migrate in the fall due to inhospitable weather. In some species, like the ones, the range map depicted on the left, the orange is the breeding area, they go to somewhere completely different, to the wintering areas in blue, as contrasted to the range map on the right, where things are a lot more messy, where you have complete migrants, say of golden eagles up in Alaska, which is this depicting, coming down and overwintering in the western U.S., mixing in with the non-migratory resident populations there and trying to figure out space use and habitat. In birds, bird migrations can be really difficult for humans to empathize with. It's different than mammal migrations, where you can imagine walking those same pathways, you can imagine those corridors, or even physically go do it. You cannot do that for bird migrations. You've got birds that are breeding in areas you've never seen before, flying over you at altitudes and speeds or in the middle of the night, and going to another area that you can't comprehend at speeds that we just physically can't do unless you're in an airplane. And so it's hard to kind of grasp that level of thinking and the scale of thinking that we need to think about for conserving bird migrations. And you know, the best example of this is, you know, you stare at that map of summer and winter ranges of the Arctic tern, and you're like, okay, yeah, that doesn't really mean anything to me other than the fact that this bird is traveling upwards of 1.8 million miles in its lifetime, traveling across the entire continent twice a year. And so this is the scale of thinking that we need to think about to conserve bird migrations. Couple that with this cool animation that you're probably not going to be able to see, which in essence, this is a depiction of birds migrating at night. Most birds migrate at night. Almost all songbirds do, ducks do, waterfowl. And so we can pick that up on radar now. And as night falls with this radar image across the entire U.S., you see all of the birds picking up, migrating at night, sunrise hits, and they all fall down for their stopover. And so you couple those long distance migrations them flying either at above the continental divide or in the middle of the night, and it just really makes what we think should be a clear picture for birds completely abstract. And so what we're trying to do is trying to piece that together, and it's a very, very difficult thing. Most of our conventional thinking on bird migration comes back to what was depicted for waterfowl. In the North American flyways was designed for waterfowl. And we think of kind of these 4 general flyways protecting these north-south movements of waterfowl, mainly to guide hunting practices and increase populations of geese and ducks. But it's not the same migration patterns for all birds as we're going to see in some of these examples. And historically, humans have identified migration routes of birds for consumptive purposes, either the flyways for hunting, for waterfowl, or the first raptor migration sites found, like Hawk Mountain here in this picture, were for shooting hawks for government bounties on the avian predators less than 100 years ago. So they would shoot thousands and thousands of hawks each year from these migration pinch points. Thankfully, now most of these areas are used for conservation and now monitoring the population trends of migratory birds through these areas. And oftentimes, those are the only way we know of what's going on with these migratory species. And for birds, unfortunately, we haven't caught up with the technology for birds as much as we'd like to. And for many, many years, the only way we could get reliable movements on data for birds was to band them like that red-tailed hawk on the right, and then hope, you band 2,000 birds and hope that you can get 20 back and figure out, I got a band return, but it doesn't necessarily mean it was in the wintering ground. I have no idea how it got from point A to point B, but this is what for almost all of the small species, this is still one of the only tools that we have to understand bird migrations and bird movements. And so here, this is an example of red-tailed hawks. The stars are the areas where they were banded. The asterisks are where they were picked up just during the winter months, so kind of depicting north-south movements. And one of the reasons I put this up here is one of the first band returns of a bird ever banded in Jackson was a red-tailed hawk banded by Olaus Muri in the 1940s, was recovered in Mexico. And as you see in this picture, the vast majority of overwintering happens in the Arizona, New Mexico region, and maybe a little bit on the Front Range. Why are birds from Jackson going an extra 1,000 miles down to Mexico to overwinter when there's so much more overwintering habitat so much closer? And so, it just really begged that question of, what's happening with the migration and why are the birds doing what they're doing? Similarly, there's some data from bald eagles here in the 80s and 90s from Al Harmada, Bob Oakleaf, and their collaborators. And you see more of a westerly movement of migration and dispersal out of the greater Yellowstone for bald eagles. And this was during the recovery period when the greater Yellowstone was the stronghold for remaining breeding bald eagles in the western U.S., really. And so this was the source population for the expansion. The bird pictured here on the left, I banded 3 years ago. That was seen down in Salt Lake City. And so now, we also use color bands, and with the amount of photographers that are out there, we're gathering more data from band returns, but it's still very limited in what we can interpret. With the advent of conventional radio tracking and, following VHF transmitters, Al and Bob were able to outfit a bald eagle and chase it with a car. And when they lost it in the car, they could find a pilot nearby. They'd go find it. And, they got some awesome, super interesting data, but clearly that's not going to get you the sample size that you need for a study. Fast forward to the past 15 years, thankfully we've got the advent of GPS transmitters. And so with birds, we have to be 100% cognizant of the weight and size of a package we put on a bird so it can still fly. So our rule of thumb is it can't be more than 3% of the total body mass of the bird. And the only way to do that is with solar panels. For years, the smallest transmitter we had was 100 grams, 95 grams, like that one depicted on the left on the bald eagle. Now, thankfully, they aren't GPS accurate, but we have transmitters down in the 9 gram and 5 gram range, which would put you on about a nutcracker. Anything smaller than that can't get a transmitter that will upload to any type of remote satellite array. So that eliminates the vast majority of species right there for data collection still. Thankfully, though, we can still get some great data. So I'm coming back to redtails. And in 1940, there was one band return of a redtail down in Mexico. More recently, some folks put satellite transmitters on redtails. I was actually involved in that study in the early 2000s. And almost all of the birds breeding here in Jackson are going down to Mexico. So we do see this total leapfrog migration is what it's called. And why they're doing it is still remains unknown. Thankfully, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. More recently, we've got a new invention called geolocators. And so these are allowing for some really coarse scale tracking of really small birds like this grasshopper sparrow depicted in the picture. And you can see some really kind of coarse outline movements like in the map on the right of the endangered Kirtland's warbler. And so it's allowing us to get a little more information, but still not as much as we possibly want. The downside is you have to get these things back, and so if the bird dies in the wintering range, or if it goes back to 20 miles away and you can't find it, you still don't get those data. Even smaller now is the MODIS system of wildlife tracking, and so you can put these transmitters on insects. The limitation here is you have to have an active receiving antenna for a presence-absence. And that map is depicted of the actual locations of the receiving antennas across the United States right now, so pretty useless in the western US. But the potential's there. All right, so let's focus on the greater Yellowstone after you got a little background. And really we have several key aspects, both spatially and temporally, that we need to think about when we're thinking about the management of the birds that occur here. We've got birds that breed here and then overwinter somewhere else down south. We've got birds that breed up in the Arctic that winter here in the greater Yellowstone region. And then we have the host of species that are moving through either on migration and or using the greater Yellowstone as stopovers. So we've got kind of four key aspects of biology, bird biology, that we need to consider when we're managing for birds and bird migration. And I think the biggest thing that we all are concerned with is protecting our biodiversity. We have greater than 275 species of birds that occur in the greater Yellowstone region. How do we maintain that level of biodiversity? And it absolutely, for birds, requires that we look well beyond our borders, as we'll see. And there, unfortunately, almost all of the management occurs at the agency level or at the state level, and we cannot think that way if we want to conserve our migratory birds. And a great example, one of the kind of classic examples of that in the avian literature is Swainson's hawks. So in the mid to late 1990s, Swainson's hawks populations in the western U.S. just dive-bombed. They were just crashing. And almost, so that a bunch of resources were put into Swainson's hawks, getting some tracking data, trying to figure out what the heck's going on. We find out that almost every single Swainson's hawk from North America goes down to the agricultural fields in the Las Pampas region of Argentina. And down there, Swainson's hawks feed primarily on grasshoppers. And down in those agricultural fields, they were using a pesticide specifically to control grasshoppers that killed an estimated 35,000 hawks, causing this significant decline. Thankfully, Bryan Woodbridge and some others were able to work with the manufacturer and they eliminated the distribution of that pesticide to the country of Argentina. Populations totally came back right away. And so understanding these connections and connectivity is key to maintaining our local biodiversity here. And so I guess I didn't point out. So I've got I outlined the greater Yellowstone region up there. And as you can see from the tracking data, it looks like, okay, the GYE doesn't really do much for Swainson's hawks. A great example, Bryan, thanks. So, we've got these known migration sites for raptors. And there's actually 4 up in Montana. One's not depicted here, but and then more recently, Doug Smith in Yellowstone and his team started migration monitoring in Yellowstone. And as you can see, those long-term migration sites up in Montana aren't picking any Swaineys up, but Yellowstone is. And so we have what was, up until now, maybe an unknown movement corridor of swains and hawks through the greater Yellowstone region. And we're just literally in the past 3 years starting to pick this out. All right, so let's focus on a few examples of from birds that are breeding in the greater Yellowstone. And I wanted to start with osprey. As most of you probably know, this is a fish-eating raptor. They're pretty much obligates for hunting fish, and their populations declined really significantly with bald eagles during the DDT era, and ever since their populations have been on the rebound. Now, osprey are pretty unique for birds in that when they fledge, they migrate somewhere that we'll see in a second, but they spend the first year and a half of their life on their wintering grounds. They don't come back here until they're 3. And so what's happening on their overwintering grounds is going to 100% affect our recruitment into our populations here. And we've got some evidence that it's not looking great. Even though the species is recovering, it's pretty common. This is data from Grand Teton, and the blue bars is the occupancy rate of territories. And you can see fewer territories are occupied as time goes on. Productivity ebbs and flows. We had a big dip in the mid to late 2000s, which initiated some of this radio tracking study that I'm going to talk about here. But really wide-ranging overwintering areas pretty much around the entire Gulf Coast, and some on the western coast of Mexico. Super interesting, just to point out, this Cuban bird flying across at least 3 known flyways. Why is it going across the plains down through Florida to Cuba? Did that 3 years, successfully bred, awesome bird. I'm super excited about it, sorry. But if we contrast, so I wanted to pull up, I need to mention that we had horrible juvenile survivorship from our study. Almost all of our juvies died before they came back to breed. And so much so that we actually stopped putting transmitters on juveniles because we're like, hey, this might be a transmitter effect. So when you compare it with a really big study going on out of Missoula with our colleagues at Raptor View Research Institute, they're having really high juvenile survivorship and recruitment back into the population. But they also see different migration patterns, so they're seeing much more of a western movement. And so there could be some, I guess the point is even small regional differences could have significant effects on what the populations are doing. So it's important to know what's happening within each of these regional populations. So another bird species that migrates down to Mexico, long-billed curlews, is a state-sensitive species for Montana and Wyoming. Jay Carlisle and his students at Boise State have recently been tracking this species, and they highlighted that in this map the greater Yellowstone birds in white and the non-GYE birds in black. Super interesting to know, almost all of these birds made that trek in one continuous flight, except for some of the ones that went down into the agricultural fields of kind of central Mexico. They did have a couple stopovers, but no idea that these birds are traveling nonstop from here to Mexico. A different kind of movement. This is not really typical what you think about with bird migrations. Bird migrations, again, you think about those north-south movements. So here's one that's going east-west, harlequin ducks. So there currently are data from 2 harlequin ducks here in Teton Park, moving up to the Pacific coast. And it's interesting to note that the greater Yellowstone is the furthest inland that this population, harlequin ducks breed. And so what's happening here could make the populations a little more vulnerable just because we're at the edge of the species range. But knowing where stopovers are is also critically important. Like the bluebird here that stops at the Puget Sound, and I'm sure some of you have heard about the contamination and eutrophication issues that the Puget Sound is having, and the implications on an insect-eating waterfowl like this could be pretty significant for our breeding populations. All right, and I put this map on the right up just as a kind of initial showcase of what we need to do in the bird community to gather enough information to make any kind of inferences. None of us have enough sample sizes to really talk about anything. We can't work at the geographic scale that we need to, so we need to create these international collaborations in combine data from multiple studies to really make any type of inference about what's happening with bird migrations. And I'm going to come back to that a couple times. Another water bird that has isolated breeding within the Greater Yellowstone, the common loon. There are less than 40 total individuals within the Greater Yellowstone. This is a completely isolated breeding area. The breeding area is outlined in that dark gray on the map, and totally different overwintering areas. So this bird was tracked with one of those geolocators, so we don't have those tracks as it's on migration, but just that first piece of where it's going to. And much different overwintering areas than our closest breeding population up in northern Montana. All right, so shifting over to the other side of the coin, birds that winter here. So we have, we think of the Yellowstone region as completely inhospitable in the winter, but some birds love it. This is sunny, warm, and tropical for them. The first of which I want to talk about are trumpeter swans. The Greater Yellowstone is the last remnant population of trumpeter swans in the lower 48 in the 1940s. During that time, less than 100 swans remained up in Canada. We had even fewer down here. And almost all of them migrated down to the Greater Yellowstone to breed. Probably some of you think, oh, we've got tons of swans. We see them all the time on Flat Creek. That's in the winter. Yellowstone National Park has had less than 5 breeding pairs for the past 10 years. In the Jackson Hole Valley, we have probably about 10 breeding pairs. And so what you're viewing and what your concept of population size needs to match up with the seasons for birds too. We know from one early satellite tracking data from Rod Druin and the Hornacher Institute in the early 2000s that almost all of the birds that winter eastern Yukon all come down to the Greater Yellowstone. And it's because the populations were so low then, almost all of those individuals came here. It became a learned kind of trait, and most now that continues where most of the Canadian population comes down and breeds here. Another one is, this is some recent tracks that we've gathered on rough-legged hawks. And yes, my 3-year-old could probably scribble on a map just as good as these roughies do, showing no route fidelity at all. And so this is what we're kind of dealing with, the range. We've got birds with huge route fidelity and birds like this that are just trying to find great areas to forage. And so maintaining those good foraging areas is kind of key. Also, this is a sample size of 7 birds. But when you add it to a more global data set and get those collaborations going, this is a data set now of 80 birds, and you can see some of those migration corridors start to pop out. And so maintaining those sample sizes and working with teams across borders is critical for bird migration. But not all birds migrate super far. We do have more local scale movements. Take example, the great gray owl. We, over the past number of years, have been looking at breeding range in the Greater Yellowstone. We've got a pretty healthy population of breeding owls, other than the fact that none of them bred last year or this year, but that's a different story. We do know that they do move pretty substantially for the winter to some very restricted winter range areas within the Greater Yellowstone. I have been in a field and seen 9 great gray owls flying around like bats at dusk. Because they're all communally going to these overwintering areas. Similarly, it's not just big geographic movements, it's also elevational migrations, like the rosy finches that are alpine obligates. And the Carl Brown and Anna Chalfoun at University of Wyoming starting to look at this, and you see elevational migrations in birds as well. So it's a little bit more complicated. And then let's talk about migration through the Greater Yellowstone. This is some efforts from a few years ago, TNC put together of mapping movement corridors based on bird groups, just on habitat associations. And so we don't have data for most species, and so this is what we're resorting to, of modeling theoretically where they would move based on their habitat associations. Thankfully, for some birds, like golden eagles, we actually do have some pretty good data that we can see if those models are holding up. And this is a collaboration, and using the same technology that has been developed for ungulates, we can develop those models of individual movement corridors, overlay them, and look at the population level corridors for golden eagles migrating in the fall and spring. And you could see a very clear movement of that huge northern migratory segment coming straight into the greater Yellowstone region. Functionally, what does that mean for a population? Thankfully for eagles, we've got some really great data from those raptor migration sites that I've talked about a couple times. And if you're right on that corridor, you're seeing upwards of 3,000 eagles move by every spring and fall. And that's just the number you're seeing. We're probably getting about 5,000 eagles moving through the greater Yellowstone region every year. What does that mean for management? Well, let's say, in southern Wyoming where that red blob is, you put 1,000 wind turbines that's going in the Chokecherry Sierra Madre, and if that falls right in that movement corridor, we might have some serious issues. And just because my model doesn't extend down into that region, it doesn't mean that the migration corridor isn't there. It's a function of sample size. And really what's happening, most of the birds we tagged on winter range in Montana, and so we don't have samples of birds moving through, and so we're going to remedy that situation over the next couple of years by tagging more individuals in southern Montana and modeling their migrations through Wyoming. Real briefly, stopover sites are also critically important for birds. Not all birds can migrate like long-billed curlews in one shot. They got to stop either by weather. Weather stops them if they're migrating down the Continental Divide, or they need to stop and refuel. And a local example of that is with bald eagles. Some of you may not know that we are a very important stopover site for bald eagles on fall migration, mainly due to the elk and the hunting that occurs here. And so you can see these are some data we collected over a couple years that hunt times are outlined in orange, and the abundance of ravens and eagles skyrockets during those times. I've counted over 100 eagles on just one trip down the refuge road during that time. And we know this is a stopover from our tracking data. So the map on the left, we tagged all the birds where the stars are. After the hunting season was over, they continued on, overwintered in areas as far south as California, went up to Canada to breed the following year, and that same next fall, they stopped here again. What does that mean, from a management perspective? Some of you are probably aware with the work that we've done, these birds are also picking up lead from these gut piles. And so they're getting that environmental contamination year after year after year. You've got a bird that can live 30, 35 years. What does that annual accumulation of this toxin mean for population levels? And as you see, during the hunting season, those lead levels skyrocket. Thankfully, we were able to do some great work in collaboration with the Refuge and Park to reduce those lead levels by using non-lead ammo. Just a little side plug there. All right, so let's go back to, what does this all mean? What if we lose these migration routes and connectivity? I wanted to give you a real quick example of sage grouse. These are some work that we did over years looking at connectivity of sage grouse. It's debatable whether or not our local population historically was migratory or not. I personally think it probably was, and that we've lost the connectivity that used to be in the Jackson population, which all the GPS locations of the Jackson birds are in blue. We tagged birds with the Forest Service and BLM up in the Upper Green and Hoback region on Forest Service lands in those red polygons. All of those birds are migratory, including the longest known migration distance of a greater sage grouse at over 135 miles down past the Red Desert. And we don't have that now in the Jackson birds. And what does that mean genetically? Complete isolation and super high inbreeding coefficients. And so, this is the kind of management implications that we need to think about. So where do we go from here? As I mentioned, we manage for over 275 bird species in the greater Yellowstone, and we know very little about the vast majority Less than 10% of our species we have movement data on. And even of our species of greatest conservation need in Wyoming, we have no movement data on greater than 85% of those species. For example, the goshawk, which is our tier 1 sensitive species, we have no movement data on. We don't even know if they're migratory or not. There are some birds here in the winter, but those birds can also be moving down from Canada. And so there's a real need on an avian side of things for regional data collection. And I wanted to point out this example with flammulated owls. Flammulated owls are tiny, completely nocturnal, and a neotropical migrant that are down, that overwinter in Mexico and Central America. Up until 2 years ago, we had no idea they were even here in the Jackson region. And now, from our night surveys and using our acoustic recorders, we have at least 16 territories that we've identified just scratching the surface. And so how is it in 2015 we find a new migratory species in Jackson that just has been overlooked? And so, this is just a highlight of the type of information that we need to continue to look for. Similarly, if you look at MAPS data, they're one of the longest running songbird banding stations in the US, occurs here in Jackson over the past 25 years. But if you just pull out the data from the past 15 years or so, you see a pretty significant negative trend in overall population indices of the about 16 focal species that were included in this analysis. What I wanted to point out is on that top graph on the right, those are our resident birds that don't migrate, and there is no significant negative trend. The temperate migrants, the ones that are only going a short distance, they do have a negative trend, but it's nothing like our neotropical migrants and our long-term birds, and their population indices are going way down. We have no idea why yet, but it's absolutely something we need to be focusing on. And so I'm coming back to, we need to change our scale of thinking. It's awesome that the Greater Yellowstone Coordinating Committee is together. We're looking at this as our Greater Yellowstone landscape, but if we want to conserve birds here, we need to blow that out of the water and think about this at a continental scale. No one wants to create a new partnership. No one wants to create a new working group. And so one of the things is, do these fit into these existing partnerships with the flyways, the joint ventures, the BCRs? Short answer is they don't. They go across all of those boundaries, and so we need to work within and amongst different groups to really understand bird migrations. There's genetic components to migration. Some birds, they take off before their adults, or their parents do, and they end up somewhere totally different. Some birds follow their parents to their overwintering sites, and it's learned, like whooping cranes, for example, totally learned behavior. Osprey, completely opposite. And then there's also weather components and habitat components that we need to take all of these into consideration. And I'm going to hammer on this collaborations. We don't have the sample sizes we need for birds to do the landscape level thinking we need to. So we need to create awesome collaborations like the Golden Eagle working group is done now. And yeah, you end up with a publication that has a page and a half of authors, but that's what it takes. This is literally what it takes to do conservation. And thankfully for golden eagles, we've got it, but for any other species, it just generally doesn't exist. And this is the scale we had to model our habitat movements at, the entire western United States, because that's the scale that eagles move at. And so it's very challenging to think that way, but we've got some great opportunities to take advantage of. The technology is getting there. We've got geolocators now that are half a gram. It's been getting so much better just in the past 15 years that I've been working with satellite transmitters. They've come down in weight by order of magnitude. We've got great ways to share information. MoveBank, for example, all the data are uploaded there. You can share all of your data instantly with any collaborator you want. We've got great, the analysis tools are only getting better and better and better, especially at these large geographic regions and scales. And we've got great outreach and media platforms, and hats off to the Wyoming Migration Initiative, using those tools, social media, mixed media, as you'll see in the gallery. We need to take advantage of those for birds too, because we've got a great way to connect communities to the Greater Yellowstone. We can connect Cuba to the greater Yellowstone. We can connect the Inuit populations up in the north to the greater Yellowstone. We need to make those stories and, and get people more invested. People love birds and bird watching, and now they love migrations and movements, and we just need to take advantage of those opportunities. Some great examples, Project Snowstorm. That project has been looking at migrations of snowy owls for the past 3 years, almost all funded by crowdsource people, and they just get online, follow their birds. The Migration Initiative, again, is a great example of a way to use mixed media to further conservation. So I just wanted to throw that out there, and with that, so many of us are fortunate not only to live in the greater Yellowstone, but also work here. And, we're fortunate enough to have groups like the Greater Yellowstone Coordinating Committee in these collaborations already here. Let's build on that to further bird conservation. And so with that, I really hope this works. This was my little moment of zen for you guys. All right. Thank you. I should point out these are the organizations that help provide data. There's a whole unbelievable number of individuals and funding organizations not attributed here, but absolutely critical to this work.
Are Canadian geese posing a problem towards any of the populations? I know that in southern areas, like they're stopping migrating, they're just settling in.
Yeah, so I just point out, just Canada geese, sorry. But, you point out, I think, a symptom of a larger problem that is going to affect all bird species and all migrations, and probably at a faster rate than technology can help us keep up with, and that's climate change and what that's doing, both climate change and changes to the landscape that are changing our migration patterns. So with Canada geese, for example, we've got a lot more lawns and urbanization that are allowing these geese to stop traditionally shorter than they normally would. And so yes, it's affecting local populations at different levels. But all across the world, we're going to see changes in movement patterns, how migrations start, where they go, and all of those things, along with, particularly with climate change of these northern migrants and changing weather patterns, because weather patterns are huge for bird migrations. Yeah.
You mentioned that none of the owls bred this year or last. Was it the owls that you said?
Yeah.
Why was that?
We're still trying to figure that out. Yeah. Last year, the winter made sense. This year, it doesn't make sense. But happy to talk about that more at length. Yeah. Yeah. Franz, go ahead, and then we'll...
I just had a question. It's kind of a personal experience question. My friend is from Florida, and she and I are here visiting, riding our horses. I live in Paradise Valley, Montana, and we parked at the Jackson Lake Lodge Corrals and rode up to Oxbow Overlook. And while we were riding back, we stopped at there was a marsh below us, and there were two swan, a mated pair there, and we wondered how rare that was.
As I mentioned, there are less than a dozen breeding pair in our local valley here. So, it's a great opportunity to be able to see one of those, and thankfully we want to do that at a distance, so we're not disturbing them too. So, awesome.
Thanks, Brian. Good work. I appreciate your sharing that with us. Years ago, I read an article research piece on white pelicans and the breeding population, particularly in Yellowstone. And from what I recall, they spend their winters in two very different locations. Do we have any data, new data? Is that still hold, or what's going on with white pelicans, I guess?
So I tried to dig up some data on white pelicans for this talk. Idaho Fish and Game has been doing some work, particularly with wing tagging, but I couldn't find any information from satellite tracking. We do have several, pelicans are colonial nesters in several distinct breeding islands, like Molly Island up in Yellowstone. But I couldn't dig up, any specific information on the birds here and kind of where they're going to. And honestly, I'm not up to date on the pelicans as much as I should be. So unfortunately, I don't have the clear answer for you.
A quick question on, and correct me if I'm wrong, but fairly recently, hasn't there been an effort to have tilting osprey nests to preclude Canada from taking over the platforms?
Yes.
And I guess my question is, has that been successful, and what is the downside of that in terms of the energy needed for the ospreys to rebuild?
So that is an effort that we started a couple years ago, mainly as a safety concern for the osprey, because as the geese take over the osprey nest, they build on power lines. They build a new nest on power lines, causing risk to the birds themselves and also the lines and distribution. And so the part of your question on the energetic costs of building a new nest for osprey, they're going to do that every year regardless. It's part of their courtship ritual. And so the energetic loss that they may have by bringing in a few more sticks, if the platform's tilted and most of them fall off, is far outweighed by the risk to mortality if they're building on new lines.
Thanks, Brian. You had mentioned a little bit about some problems with low rates of survival for osprey. Do we know any about the drivers of any of that?
We do not. So unfortunately, we were unable to recover the vast majority of the birds that we tagged, mainly just because the transmitter was just cut out. And so it was unclear on if it was transmitter failure or the bird was dead. We never saw any of our birds come back. They were all color banded as well. And we also ran into some issues where we had one disappear, and the last locations were in a village in some pretty rough areas of Mexico. We actually did send biologists out, and they went knocking on the doors of random houses, and it was like, you don't necessarily have to put your safety at that risk. So there is a human persecution issue in some regions that we know about for many bird species, especially raptors. But we don't have clear answers on that yet, no.